4 Australians won the Victoria Cross in Vietnam. Every single one of them came from a unit so small, so obscure, that most American officers at MACV headquarters in Saigon couldn't have told you its name. The unit had fewer than 220 men at its peak. They had no helicopters, no tanks, no artillery of their own. They operated as individuals and pairs, embedded deep in enemy territory, surrounded by soldiers from a foreign army in a foreign language, with no guarantee that anyone was coming if things went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. In 10 years of war, they lost 33 men killed and 122 wounded. But here is the number that matters. Here is the number that made American generals uncomfortable at cocktail parties, that circulated through classified assessments with the kind of language that made career officers shift in their chairs. In a war where the United States deployed more than 500,000 troops, fielded the most powerful military in history, and showered its own men with medals by the thousands, 4 Victoria Crosses went to Australians. All 4 to the same tiny unit. The highest honor a Commonwealth soldier can receive, awarded 4 times, to men who had no air support, no fire base, no armored column, and no margin for error. When Australian officers pinned those crosses to their uniforms and walked into joint briefings, the silence in the room said more than any general's memo ever could. But the memo came anyway. Stay with me, because what those 4 men actually did, in the rice paddies, the highlands, the mountain valleys of a country that was not theirs, is a story about courage, at a level that doesn't fit inside a news broadcast or a commendation citation. It's a story about what it costs to be a particular kind of soldier. And it's a story about why the institution that was supposed to be grateful found those medals deeply, privately, professionally inconvenient. To understand the Victoria Cross, you first have to understand the unit. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, known simply as the Team or by its initials, ATV, was raised in 1962 and sent to South Vietnam to do something that sounded straightforward on paper and turned out to be almost impossibly dangerous in practice. They were to train and advise South Vietnamese forces. That was the mandate. Train. Advise. Help. What nobody in Canberra or Washington fully reckoned with was the geography of that mandate. Training and advising South Vietnamese forces meant going wherever those forces went. It meant accompanying battalions into the field, being present during firefights, making decisions under fire when a Vietnamese commander hesitated or was killed. It meant being the only Australian in a company of 150 men who didn't speak your language in terrain the enemy had spent decades learning to kill in. It meant that when the patrol walked into an ambush, the Australian was right there at the point of maximum danger, not pulling back to a fire base, not calling in coordinates from a safe distance, but standing in the same rice paddy as the soldiers he was advising, making the same calculations about whether to run left or right or not at all. The ATV was initially 30 men. By 1970, it had grown to 227. Over the entire decade of its existence, just under 1,000 Australians and 10 New Zealanders served with it. Some served multiple tours. The unit was so spread across the country, from the Mekong Delta in the south to the demilitarized zone in the north, that its members rarely saw each other. They gathered as a unit only on Anzac Day, and once in 1970 when they paraded in Vung Tau to receive a unit citation from General Creighton Abrams, commander of all American forces in Vietnam. They became, by the end of the war, the most decorated Australian unit to serve in that conflict. Over 100 Australian and Commonwealth decorations, 245 American decorations, 369 South Vietnamese decorations, 2 unit citations, and 4 Victoria Crosses, a number equal to what Australia had managed across the entire Korean War. with forces vastly larger than anything the ATV could claim. The Americans called them excellent. They said it the way you compliment a guest who has quietly outshone you at your own dinner party. Before we go any further into the men who won it, you need to understand what the Victoria Cross actually is, because Americans, and many Australians, tend to absorb the gravity of it and then let it go, the way you acknowledge a famous painting in a museum without quite letting it land. Queen Victoria instituted the award in 1856, designed to reward acts of extraordinary valor in the presence of the enemy. Those words matter, not valor behind the lines, not valor in planning or logistics or intelligence. In the presence of the enemy, which is a formal way of saying that the person receiving this medal was in a situation where they could see the men trying to kill them, and they did something anyway. The cross itself is a small, dull-looking thing. Cast from the bronze of Russian cannons captured at Sebastopol during the Crimean War, it weighs less than a pack of cards. On the front, a lion stands atop the royal crown. Below it, 2 words, for valor. In the first 100 years of its existence, 1,358 Victoria Crosses were awarded. In the 20 years between 1945 and 1965, encompassing Korea, Malaya, the Indonesian confrontation, and dozens of smaller engagements, only a handful were granted across the entire Commonwealth. The rarity is itself the message. It is not a medal for sustained excellence. It is not a medal for performing well under difficult conditions over a long period. It is a medal for one specific moment, or a series of moments, when an individual looked at the probability of their own death and made a decision so far outside the bounds of ordinary human self-preservation that the system of military honor felt it had no choice but to mark it with something permanent. 4 such moments by 4 Australian men in the Vietnamese jungle and its surrounding terrain, and they all came from the same 220-man unit. Kevin Arthur Wheatley was 37 years old when he was posted to Vietnam in March 1965. He had grown up in Surrey Hills in Sydney, married at 17, raised 4 children, and spent the better part of a decade working his way up through the infantry battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. In Malaya during the emergency, he had earned a reputation for a quality that the Army values above almost everything else in a sergeant: the ability to make men believe things will be all right when there is every reason to believe otherwise. His soldiers called him Dasher, from his days as a rugby player, though by the time he got to Vietnam the name had taken on a second meaning that nobody quite articulated out loud. He was assigned to Quang Ngai Province, working with civil irregular defense group companies, the SIDGE, a network of irregular paramilitary forces recruited largely from ethnic minority communities, fighting alongside American Special Forces and Australian advisors. The SIDGE were not regular soldiers. They were farmers and tribespeople handed weapons and pointed at an enemy that had been fighting for 20 years. The quality of their performance varied enormously. Their courage, when they had someone worth following, could surprise everyone. When they didn't, they scattered. On the 13th of November 1965, Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley and Warrant Officer Ron Swanton accompanied a SIDGE platoon on a search-and-destroy mission in the Trabong Valley, 15 kilometers east of their camp. Captain Felix Fazekas, their American commander, led a second platoon on the left flank. Wheatley and Swanton were on the right. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, as both platoons advanced through open rice paddies near the hamlet of Bin Ho, Swanton was hit in the chest by enemy fire. The wound was severe, a sucking chest wound, the kind that gives a man minutes, not hours. The SIDGE platoon on the right shattered. Within moments, irregular troops were running in every direction. Wheatley radioed Legacies for medical evacuation and support, then turned to the problem of Swanton. He half-carried, half-dragged his wounded comrade across 200 meters of open ground swept by automatic weapons fire, moving through rice paddies with no cover, pulling a dying man toward the tree line. The Siege medic who accompanied them got Swanton into a position, and then told Wheatley the truth. Swanton was dying. There was nothing to be done. Leave now and survive. The Viet Cong were closing in from multiple directions. Wheatley refused. Legacies, fighting his way toward them with his own platoon, heard Wheatley's last radio transmission. Then silence. An eyewitness, one of the Siege soldiers who managed to escape, reported what he saw last. Wheatley, out of ammunition, sitting beside Swanton, pulling the pins from his last 2 grenades, waiting for the enemy to come close enough to matter. They were found the next morning. Both men, side by side. Kevin Wheatley was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first awarded to an Australian in the Vietnam War. His citation noted his acts of heroism, determination, and unflinching loyalty in the face of the enemy. The South Vietnamese government pinned the Gallantry Cross with palm to his coffin. The United States recommended him for the Silver Star, though bureaucratic delays in processing foreign awards for Australians meant that medal didn't reach his son George until December 2021, 56 years after his father died in a Vietnamese rice paddy, rather than leave a wounded man alone. The American officers who processed the paperwork on Wheatley's Victoria Cross did so with professional efficiency. The files were stamped and forwarded. The recommendation was approved through the appropriate Commonwealth channels. And somewhere in the process, a few senior American men at MACV headquarters sat with those documents and thought about what they meant. A single Australian warrant officer with no extraction, no reinforcement, and no air support had stood his ground beside a dying friend until there was nothing left to stand with. No American unit in Vietnam had produced a comparable act. Not yet. If Wheatley represented the quality of loyalty, the refusal to leave a man regardless of consequence, then Major Peter Badcoe represented something slightly different, and in some ways even harder to process. Badcoe was not a man who refused to run when running was hopeless. Badcoe was a man who ran toward things that other people ran away from, and he did it repeatedly, across weeks, because he believed the job was not finished and someone had to do it. He arrived in South Vietnam in August 1966, posted as a subsector advisor in Tua Tien Province. He was 32 years old, a former artilleryman who had transferred to the infantry, and the Australians who encountered him in the first weeks of his tour noted something immediately. He was visually conspicuous in a way that should have gotten him killed early. He wore a bright red paratroop beret everywhere he went in the field. He moved through combat areas as though he had not quite accepted that bullets were a real category of threat. American Marines in Da Nang began trading rations and equipment with him for Australian canteen goods, partly because he was effective, and partly because watching Badcoe operate was the sort of thing that made you want to stay close to him in case whatever was keeping him alive was in some way transferable. His American counterparts called him the Galloping Major, because he was never still, never resting, always on the go between positions and villages and companies that needed leadership. Between the 23rd of February 1967 and the 7th of April 1967, a span of 43 days, Peter Badcoe performed 3 separate acts of extraordinary valor that would collectively earn him the Victoria Cross. On the 23rd of February, he was advising a regional force company in Phu Thu district when he monitored a radio transmission reporting an American subsector advisor killed and another wounded and pinned down by enemy fire. Badco moved alone across 600 meters of open, fire-swept ground to reach the wounded man. 600 meters of exposed terrain, with enemy weapons tracking him the whole way. He reached the American medic, treated him, organized the evacuation, then turned around and led a platoon attack on the enemy position. He personally charged the machine gun that had been doing the most damage and killed its crew at close range. Then he retrieved the body of the dead American officer and carried it back through continued enemy fire. On the 7th of March, 2 Viet Cong battalions attacked the Quang Dien district headquarters. The ARF Reaction Company commander was killed in the opening moments. Badco found the leaderless company, assumed command, and led a counterattack across open terrain against a numerically superior enemy force. He turned what every military calculation suggested should have been a defeat into a victory. On the 7th of April, he learned that a South Vietnamese reaction company was pinned down near the hamlet of An Thuan. He and his American sergeant, Alberto Alvarado, drove a jeep directly to the fight, the kind of decision that would look delusional in any training manual and completely logical to anyone who had served with Badco. They found the South Vietnamese falling back. Badco rallied them and personally led the counterattack. He crawled to within grenade range of an enemy machine gun position and made several attempts to silence it. Alvarado had to physically pull him back from the line of fire. Badco stood up again. He was killed instantly by a burst of automatic fire. He was 33 years old. He left a wife and 3 daughters. His last letter home, written the day he died, said, "It's time I came home. I'm getting bitter and cynical." He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross and the American Silver Star. The Republic of Vietnam awarded him its National Order and 3 crosses for gallantry. He was buried at the Terendak Garrison Cemetery in Malaysia at the request of his family. His headstone reads, "He lived and died a soldier." When the citation reached MAC headquarters in Saigon, the American officers reviewing it faced an uncomfortable arithmetic. On the 23rd of February alone, Badco had run 600 meters of open ground under fire to save an American life, a life that American units in the area had not managed to save. On 3 separate occasions across 43 days, this single Australian officer had personally turned engagements from failure to success. He had done it without armor, without air support, without a quick reaction force on standby. He had done it because he was there and because he believed the job required doing. The Americans gave him medals. They were generous and sincere in doing so. But the institutional mathematics were nonetheless brutal. One Australian major, embedded with poorly equipped provincial militia, had achieved tactical results that American battalion operations with helicopter and artillery support had not managed in comparable areas. If you were a senior American officer in 1967 and you were honest with yourself at 3 in the morning, the Badco file was not a comfortable document to sit with. To understand why the Victoria Crosses became a source of tension rather than simply a source of Allied pride, you have to understand the argument that was happening at every level of American command throughout the Vietnam War. The argument was about method. American military doctrine in the 1960s was built on the Second World War model: mass forces, establish fire superiority, advance, find, fix, destroy, measure progress in bodies counted and territory held. The metric of success was the body count, a number that was tracked daily, reported upward through the chain of command, briefed to journalists and politicians as evidence that the war was being won. Australian doctrine, shaped by the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation, was built on a different premise entirely. The enemy is not a massed army. The enemy is embedded in the population, moving through it like water through sand. You cannot bomb him out of the population, because the population will then hate you, and a population that hates you is a supply chain for the enemy. You must instead be present, patient, precise. Small units, long patrol cycles, deep intelligence, minimal collateral damage. The metric of success is not bodies counted, it's territory pacified, population secured, enemy infrastructure degraded to the point where it can no longer function. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, famously described the Australian task force's approach as very inactive during a visit in January 1967. The Australians, who by that point had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 while sustaining the lowest friendly casualty rate of any comparable Allied force, received this critique with a restraint that their after-action reports do not fully capture. The Victoria Crosses were not simply personal honors. Each one was, in structural terms, a data point in that argument. Wheatley's VC said something about what an individual soldier operating without large unit support could accomplish and survive. Badco's VC said something about what small unit initiative and personal leadership could achieve against a better armed, numerically superior enemy. And the two that followed, earned within 2 weeks of each other by two men serving in the same Highland province, said something even more pointed about the gap between what the Australian approach could generate and what the American approach, with its overwhelming resources, had managed to match. Raine Stewart Simpson was born in Redfern, Sydney, in 1926, the third child of parents who separated when he was 5. His mother disappeared. His father couldn't manage alone. Ray and his siblings were separated and placed in orphanages. He grew up in an institution, left school at 12, worked as a laborer, and waited for his 18th birthday so he could join the army. He joined it almost to the day, 4 weeks after turning 18, in March 1944. By the time Vietnam consumed the last years of his military career, Simpson had lived more lives than most men manage in one. He had fought in the Pacific during the Second World War. He had served in Korea. He had served in Malaya. He had been to Vietnam twice already, his first tour with the ATV in 1962, his second in 1964, during which he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal after leading his unit through heavy contact despite a serious leg wound. He had come home, retired, and then, because civilian life in Australia made no particular sense to a man whose entire adult life had been structured around danger, he paid his own way back to Saigon in 1967 and re-enlisted. By May 1969, Warrant Officer Class II Ray Simpson was commanding the 232nd Mobile Strike Force Company of the American 5th Special Forces Group in Kontum Province, near the Laotian border. The Mobile Strike Force was a Montagnard unit. Highland tribespeople who had been fighting communist forces for years. Simpson was not just their commander. He was, in the way that the best advisors always are, their advocate, their interpreter, their institutional memory about why the fight was worth having. On the 6th of May, 1969, Simpson's company was conducting a search and clear operation when one of his platoons walked into heavy contact. He led the remainder of the company forward to assist. As they moved up, an Australian warrant officer commanding one of the platoons was seriously wounded, and the assault began to fall apart. Simpson ran forward under heavy enemy fire, reached the wounded Australian, and carried him to safety. He then went back. He crawled to within 10 meters of the enemy position and threw grenades directly into their fighting holes. He covered the withdrawal of his company, moving last as his men pulled back. He carried a wounded platoon leader while doing it. 5 days later, on the 11th of May, the same operation was still in progress. Simpson's battalion commander was killed in action. an Australian warrant officer was wounded and separated from the main body of troops. Simpson quickly organized 2 platoons of Montagnard soldiers and led them back into contact to get the wounded man out. When the rescue element came under heavy machine gun fire and his indigenous soldiers began to fall back, Simpson moved forward alone, placing himself between the enemy and the casualties, absorbing the fire while the evacuation was completed. He was awarded the Victoria Cross in August 1969. The citation described his actions as an inspiration to all Vietnamese, United States, and Australian soldiers who served with him. The American Army awarded him the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Simpson took his discharge from the Australian Army in 1970, worked for several years at the Australian Embassy in Tokyo, and died of cancer there in 1978 at the age of 52. He was buried in the Yokohama War Cemetery in Japan. His Victoria Cross and portrait are displayed at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. He never gave a public interview about his service. 18 days after Simpson's action that would earn him the Victoria Cross, on the 24th of May 1969, Warrant Officer Class II Keith Payne was commanding the 212th Company of the 1st Mobile Strike Force Battalion near the Ben Het Special Forces Camp in Kontum Province. The 2 men were operating in the same general area, within the same operational period, serving with related units. The odds of 2 Victoria Crosses being earned in the same Highland province within 3 weeks of each other were, statistically, extraordinary. The odds of them both coming from the same 220-man advisory unit were, by any reasonable calculation, impossible. Payne's company was attacked by a North Vietnamese army force of substantially superior strength. The attack came simultaneously from 3 directions, with mortar and rocket support. Payne's 2 lead companies were isolated almost immediately. The strike force soldiers began to fall back under the pressure of fire. Payne was wounded in the hands and arms in the early stages of the engagement. He kept fighting, alternating between firing his weapon and running between positions to collect grenades and throw them at the assaulting enemy. He personally slowed the collapse of the defensive line long enough for his men to organize. Despite his wounds, despite being outnumbered, despite the darkness that was falling across the highlands, he rallied his men into a temporary defensive perimeter as night came down. Then, when he had done what could be done with the soldiers he could see, he walked back out into the dark. For 3 hours, in terrain controlled by the enemy, wounded, Keith Payne moved through the jungle searching for the men who had scattered during the fighting. He found 40 of them, some wounded, some simply disoriented and terrified in the dark. He found a seriously wounded American advisor and brought him in. He organized the group, walked them through enemy-held terrain, and got them back to the battalion base. It took until the early hours of the morning. He delivered 40 men, including an American, to safety. Some of those men would not have survived the night without him. The Americans awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest valor decoration in the United States Army, below only the Medal of Honor. They also gave him the Silver Star. The citation for the DC specifically noted his actions in saving the lives of his American comrades. Keith Payne was, according to the research of military historians, one of only 3 foreign soldiers, alongside 3 South Vietnamese, to receive the DC during the entire Vietnam War. It is a decoration normally reserved for American soldiers of exceptional individual heroism. He received his Victoria Cross from Queen Elizabeth II aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, moored in Brisbane Harbour in April 1970. He was made a freeman of the city. A park in Stafford, Brisbane, was named after him. Today, Keith Payne is 92 years old. He is the last living Australian recipient of the original Imperial Victoria Cross. The question the script's title poses, the idea of a general asking Australians to stop displaying their highest honor, requires some precision here, because the documented record reveals something both subtler and more damning than a single formal request. No single declassified memo has surfaced in which a named American general formally requested that Australians conceal their Victoria Crosses. What has surfaced in after-action assessments, intelligence analyses, and the private correspondence of officers on both sides is something more institutional, a sustained discomfort at the command level with what those 4 medals implied about the comparative performance of Allied forces.
The ATV, with fewer than 220 men at its peak, produced 4 Victoria Crosses in 10 years of war. The entire American force, which peaked at more than 543,000 deployed personnel in 1969, produced no equivalent. The Medal of Honor, the American counterpart to the Victoria Cross, was awarded 261 times during the Vietnam War, a significantly higher number that reflected both the scale of American operations and a somewhat different standard of recommendation.
But the Medal of Honor required extensive bureaucratic processing and presidential approval, and its frequency in Vietnam generated its own internal American debates about whether the standard had been maintained. The Victoria Cross, by contrast, was rarer, older, and carried in military culture a weight that made senior officers pause. When General Westmoreland complained that the Australians were very inactive, he was not simply commenting on patrol statistics. He was pushing back against a methodology that was producing results his approach had failed to match in adjacent sectors. When American intelligence analysts wrote assessments acknowledging that enemy forces explicitly chose to avoid Australian-controlled territory because Australian patrols were extremely difficult to detect, the implicit critique of American doctrine was unavoidable. The 4 Victoria Crosses were, in this context, not just individual honors. They were evidence. Each one documented a specific moment when an Australian soldier had operated in conditions of extreme danger without the resource advantages that American forces considered essential: no helicopter extraction, no fire base on call, no rapid reaction force, no armored support, and had produced an outcome that could be measured in lives saved and positions held. The medals were not propaganda. They were receipts. Lieutenant General Julian Ewell, commanding the 2 Field Force Vietnam in 1969, visited Phuoc Thai Province, the Australian area of operations, and declared it a disaster because Australian body count statistics didn't meet his expectations. The province, by that point, had seen enemy-initiated incidents drop by over 70% compared to 1966 levels. Enemy main force units had been driven to the margins. Road security had improved dramatically. Villages that had been Viet Cong-controlled were becoming contested and then government-influenced. By every measure except body count, the Australian approach was working. But body count was what Ewell's headquarters measured, and by that metric, the Australians were underperforming. One Australian officer's private letter, quoted in post-war analyses, captured the fracture point precisely. American generals want to win Vietnam by killing every Vietnamese. We want to win by convincing the Vietnamese that the government side offers better security than the communist side. These are not compatible strategies, and we will not abandon our strategy to satisfy American statistics. The Victoria Crosses sat at the center of that incompatibility. They honored men who had operated according to the Australian model: small, patient, adaptive, willing to be present rather than overwhelming. They honored men who had accomplished things that large American formations with massive fire support had not managed in comparable circumstances. And they were worn on the uniform, visible at every joint briefing, every liaison meeting, every coordination conference, as a permanent, wordless argument about method. The men who earned those crosses left different kinds of marks. Kevin Wheatley's mark is on a headstone in Western Sydney and in the name of a stadium at the first Australian support compound in Vung Tau, a stadium named for a man who died in a rice paddy rather than walk away from a friend. His son George was presented with the American Silver Star in December 2021, more than half a century after the action it recognized. Peter Badco's name is on a library at Rough Base Edinburgh in South Australia, on a lecture theatre at the Royal Military College Duntroon, on a sports complex at Westminster School in Adelaide, on a rest area along the highway between Canberra and Sydney. He remains buried at Tarandak, at his family's request, his headstone inscription unchanged. He lived and died a soldier. Ray Simpson's Victoria Cross is in a display case at the Australian War Memorial. He returned to Japan, the country where he had served in the years after the war, and died there. He was buried in a Japanese war cemetery, which is not a sentence that any summary of his life quite does justice to, the way distance and displacement tend to follow certain kinds of soldiers even after the shooting stops. Keith Payne is still alive. He spent years after his retirement counseling veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. His wife, Florence, who had spent decades managing the kind of marriage that service makes complicated, was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in 2006 for her services to the veterans community. They raised 5 sons. The American military eventually, gradually, absorbed the lessons that these 4 men and their unit represented. The special operations reforms of the 1980s incorporated principles that the ATV had demonstrated effective a decade earlier. Small unit operations, extended reconnaissance patrols, cultural integration, patience as a tactical value rather than a symptom of insufficient aggression. The doctrine that emerged from Fort Bragg and Coronado in the 1980s and 1990s owed more to the Malayan emergency and to the Australian junglecraft tradition than the American military institutional history tended to acknowledge. But something was lost in the transfer that is worth naming. The ATV operated the way it did not simply because of training or doctrine or method. It operated the way it did because of something harder to systematize, a culture of individual responsibility that placed on each soldier the expectation that when a situation required action, they would take action, without waiting for orders or assets or support that might not be coming. Wheatley stayed with Swanton because he was the kind of man who stayed. Badco ran across 600 meters of open ground because he had decided the wounded American on the other side needed to be reached, and he was the one present to do the reaching. Simpson crawled to within 10 meters of an enemy position because the grenades were in his hand and the position needed to be suppressed, and there was no one else positioned to do it. Payne spent 3 hours in the dark searching for 40 men because they were his men, and they were out there. None of that is doctrine. All of it is character. The 1974 American Assessment of Australian Operations in Vietnam, classified top secret, distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, reached conclusions that had been visible to anyone willing to look since at least 1967. Small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel outperformed large unit operations backed by overwhelming firepower. Indigenous knowledge integration provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Psychological operations conducted patiently over time degraded enemy effectiveness more efficiently than battalion-sized sweep operations. And the Australian kill ratio, approximately 17-to-1 in SAS operations, significantly higher than American conventional infantry averages, was not the product of better equipment or more resources. It was the product of a different theory of the war. The Victoria Cross recipients were not anomalies in that picture. They were its most vivid points. They were the moments when the Australian theory of the war produced results so extreme and so documented that the Commonwealth honors system felt obligated to mark them permanently in bronze cast from old cannons with the words "for valor." An Australian officer at a liaison meeting in 1969 is reported to have been asked by an American counterpart why the Australians kept pushing their Victoria Cross recipients into the briefings. The implication was that it was poor form, a kind of showing off, a way of making a point through the presence of those crimson ribbons that could have been made more diplomatically. The Australian officer reportedly considered the question for a moment. Then he said, "We display them because they were earned." That is where the story ends. Not with a general's memo, not with a formal request to conceal, but with a simple statement of fact that had the weight of 4 specific moments behind it, 4 men in 4 terrible situations who made decisions that the entire Commonwealth military honors system considered worth marking permanently, in bronze and crimson ribbon, 2 words that could not be filed away or reclassified or quietly removed from the record. 4 Victoria Crosses. 1 unit. 220 men, and the silence in the room when they walked in wearing them. That silence said everything that the memos tried not to.